Okay, so myself and Alfie are here today to help you get through this slightly weird scenario. So we've been trying to be very careful with our words and as concise as possible. For we've carefully chosen these words. So the slides are very light in terms of words. The verbal content is going to be there for you as well. And we always like to use a kind of Lego theme because we like bringing different people together, different backgrounds, and that's what makes the magic work. So the concept for this webinar is don't let your next redevelopment be killed by CIL. And that's to how avoid crippling CIL costs and keep your next project viable, both in terms of ethically, legally, and on a timely basis. So we're trying to do this in a way that doesn't add to the timeline for your development. Mark, could we have the next slide, please? So a brief bit of background about us as speakers. So ASTOP, I'm the founder and director of ASTOP. I've been running this and similar charitable organizations for about 15 years now. So what we've done is we've repurposed empty spaces on a temporary rolling basis. So it's on a win-win collaboration basis with landlords, councils sign off on it. So it's kind of a three-way relationship that's going on there. And that's what we do. In the recent years, we've come across Alfie, and we'll be telling that story in depth. Alfie, could you introduce yourself and why you're here?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Alfie Yetman. I am a director at HGH Consulting, and we are planning consultants. So typically, we spend most of our time applying for and dealing with planning applications, but we also sort of consult on various planning issues around that as bread and butter, and one of those issues is CIL as well. So that's what we're here to talk about. But that's a small part of what we do. We spend most of our life applying for or advising clients about applications for planning permissions.
Great stuff. Alfie, the Yoda Yeatman, has got a mind full of knowledge, and it's my job to mine it out of him. So I'll keep it very light and kind of, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to ask Alfie the answer to those questions. And it's his knowledge. It's going to be tapped into quite a lot here. So you'll be hearing quite a lot from him. Okay, great stuff. So look, we're very practical people. We've made this work in Bromley. We know of other case studies that we're going to tell you about as well. And really what we want to do is make sure that you guys get something out of this. So firstly, we need to explain to you what CIL is very briefly, because I think a lot of you will know, but we've got commercial finance people and others here talk to you conceptually how that converts into what the rules are, which is where Alfie will come in, and then the legitimate way to actually get out of CIL if the situation and the ingredients make it line up. So why this webinar is to literally take you on this journey. So when does CIL kick in? So as a person from the charity sector and dabbled in commercial property, but not on the planning side, community infrastructure levies is basically that. If you're adding to the pressure on the sewage system, doctors, surgeries, schools, you need to contribute towards that. That's the concept at a high level. That's translated into legislation. And there's rules about has it been empty for 3 years, and Alfie will fill you in on stuff like that. So that's when CIL kicks in, when there is added pressure coming in. And then how you can mitigate is basically, if we look at the rules for what is added pressure to community infrastructure, if you fall outside the scope of that, that's basically what we're trying to assist you to do. And that's where the magic happens, where a lot of individuals who might be looking at a project's viability think about, okay, you've got the purchase price, you've got the development costs, you've got this Section 106, CIL, interest on repayments, all of that to pay. If that number is bigger than the potential sale value, it's not worth it. But there are some numbers in that costings where if you are able to legitimately get out of that or change your focus on it, then it might flip the viability to something quite special. And we'll see that in the case of Bromley. Alfie, have you got anything to add at this point, or should we jump straight into the next slide?
No, we can jump straight in. I would add that this is obviously a bit of a technical issue and a specialist element of the planning process. It's a little bit boring, but we'll try and keep it as interesting as possible. And I think the end goal is just to help identify potential pitfalls of the CIL system. It's an issue that we deal with quite regularly, that people come to us with either planning permissions they already have or are looking to apply for, and the cost of CIL is a big issue because it can be a lot of money. So the intention is to just talk through a couple of instances where people can get tripped up by sill and how to manage it. Um, but obviously your mileage may vary, and seeking specialist advice is often advised in these scenarios. But we can touch on that as we run through the next few slides.
Great stuff. Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. So we think there's two magic ingredients that when CIL kicks in, we're trying to keep this as high level and simple as possible. So when you are going for a change of use, and as I say, Alfie will cover off on that when it comes to prior approvals or new planning applications and so on, plus a long-term void, which I believe in legislation means has it been not used for more than 3 years. When you put those two together, you get a potential CIL liability. However, what we're trying to do is we don't want to mess around with someone's change of use plans because that's your speciality. But if we can work with you to kind of fall outside the scope of what is a long-term void, that's when there can be a shift. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that changing over. Mark. Excellent, thank you. So Alfie, correct me if I'm wrong, but 6 months plus occupancy during the last 3 years prior to a date that you're going to explain to us is
Mhm.
what will mean that something is no longer deemed to be a long-term void. Is that roughly right?
That is correct. I'll just touch on how the CIL system works. For those that have dealt with it before, they're probably aware that it's typically engaged when development is proposing new floor space of 100 square meters or above. Um, so that part of the process is relatively straightforward to understand, but it becomes more difficult when you're applying for development that involves either the change of use of existing buildings into other uses, and or demolition of existing floor space. And in both cases, when the existing floor space has not been in active use for a period of time, there comes some challenges. So essentially, an existing building can be taken into account of when calculating CIL and used to offset the value of CIL. With its proposed floor space. Effectively, the CIL rate is set by local authorities, and it's on a per square meter basis. So, like all new residential development, maybe £100 per square meter, for instance. But when there's an existing building that's been demolished, or when the use is changing, you can use that existing floor space to offset the proposed development as a whole. Um, But the existing floor space can only be used to offset that development where part of the building has been in a lawful use for a continuous period of 6 months within the past 3 years. So 3 years is the headline figure, but in reality, if a building has been vacant for more than 2.5 years and hasn't been in active use in that period, then that existing floor space is not liable to be offset against your proposed or your proposal in the CIL payment that is due. Just a couple of other things to note as well is when in an example where a building is, say, in a lawful use as an office, the existing office floor space needs to actually be used for that lawful use. So it can't be used for storage or any other ancillary uses. It needs to be continuously used for a period of at least 6 months as an office. And that applies for, I don't know, if it's a retail use that it's lawful use, if it's residential, it needs to actively be used for that lawful use for that period of at least 6 months.
Okay, cool.
Um, one other just point to note is, because obviously the point of the date and the point of time in which this is calculated is important. For planning permissions, the date in which the previous 3 years applies is the date on which planning permission was granted. So it's not from when an application was submitted. We've had a few instances where, and it's not uncommon for applications to take, years sometimes, particularly if there's legal agreements that are involved. So on that date, even if you applied, years before, it's the date in which the decision notice is issued that the 3-year period starts. The other exemption to that is if you have a prior approval permission under permitted development rights, and the relevant date in that instance is after the prior approval is granted and when you serve a notice, it's called CIL Form 5, to the council, telling them that the development is commencing. So at that point, the 3-year date is 3-year preceding date is calculated.
Okay. So that's probably the Bromley example that we're about to cover off in a bit more depth.
Exactly. Yeah, the Bromley example that we're going to refer to, that was a permitted development change of use prior approval.
Okay, great stuff. So I think you've nailed it in the sense that you've told us enough to know that, wow, this is complicated. So to get good advice at the right time,
Yeah.
because say I didn't until meeting Alfie and spending a bit of time with it, I had no idea about the difference between prior approval, this date of commencement thing, and it's all very simple in my head. But my head is a very simple place, so it's not a good place to be. Brilliant. Thanks for that, Alfie. Mark, could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so we're now going to take you on this journey. So Bromley is actually an ex-council office. So we've got the Bromley Council Estate right now in the middle of the town centre near Bromley South. And just to the south of that, there were two buildings called the Y buildings because they're Y-shaped. And between the two of them, they're connected, 20,000 square feet. Each building is about 3 stories high. But the council itself had not used this building for the last 10 years. So you can imagine how decrepit it had become. And for the council, it had beginning to feel like a liability rather than an asset. So if we can go to the next slide, the scenario is literally as I've described it. But on top of that, as I say, for the council, it's becoming a liability. But when you look at this building, you know that this could be a wonderful set of apartments. It was surrounded by trees, very green area, very close to the town centre, train station, etc., etc. So if it was going to stay as a council office, an unused one, it was going to be a waste of an asset. So that Bromley Council was the owner. They were kind of on side to make sure that the planning process kind of goes through. But on top of that, they didn't want to do the development. So they sold up to a client. So basically Alfie and our client. Things got a little bit complicated in the sense that it always takes longer than everyone anticipates. So we ended up being there, I think it was for about 1.5 years as opposed to just the 6 months. And again, part of that is because when the planning, whether it's the planning permission date or the actual commencement work date, you kind of never know how long it's going to be. So it's best to play it safe and make sure that your 6 months is captured in there. So that was the scenario there. It's now converting, the works are underway, it's nearly finished, but it has all taken a bit of time. So Alfie and his crew, so reaching out to A-Stop was one of the first things they did. So Alfie, just to recap, in terms of the time window and reaching out to someone to help you find a solution for this 6-month window, when is the best time to start talking to someone and when is the best time to start bringing them in?
Well, sooner is usually better than later. As I mentioned before, this is quite a more unusual scenario because it wasn't a planning permission. It was a permitted development prior approval process for a change of use. You've got a bit more flexibility in terms of when the CIL commencement is due to take place. So in this scenario, our clients actually bought the site with the prior approval permission in place. So they went through that process. The building was clearly unused, unoccupied for an extended period of time. They had then the ability to occupy it using a stop in this instance for a prolonged period of time prior to then serving the commencement notice on the council and sort of starting the CIL process. So yeah, it's an important step to get in place, and in this case, we tried to get it put in place very early on after our client took ownership of the site.
Okay, great stuff. We'll talk about the other benefits from doing that earlier rather than later in a further slide. So our role basically is to source and manage on-site charity tenants. Again, we've been careful about the words that we choose here. So the reason we only work with charity tenants, it's part of our ethos, but also they're nimble. If you were to go off and try and find a commercial tenant and say to them, is this really horrible rundown building on the southern estate of Bromley Council, would you like to move in for 6 months? And even if you offer it to them rent-free, the chances are a commercial organization probably got a bit of funding behind them. would think, okay, I'm going to incur all these costs for moving in, got to run my project, but then I have to move out probably in about 6 months because the landlord always wants the flexibility of making sure that he gets the site back. So most commercial organizations won't do that. Charities who are tighter on funding and probably more nimble in many respects are able to do that. Plus, there's all these other benefits that they bring along in terms of business rates and other things. So that's what we do at A-Stop. It's kind of act as the conduit, the middleman, to look after the councils, to look after the landlords, to look after the charity sector, and just make the whole thing hum. So it's our job to find and vet the suitable tenants. So as Alfie said, this was an office. We needed to make sure we used it as an office. We can't just chuck storage in there. We can't retail out of there. So we have to kind of go through that matching process. We need to move them in. We need to make sure those charities understand that they're going to need to sign the equivalent of a stat deck. They're going to have to move out when required, and just make sure they're the sort of organization that we vetted to make sure that they won't get in the way when the time comes or cause any problems. Charities of good standing. We obviously need to gather evidence. Again, we'll kind of cover that in a little bit more depth. Alfie's got some very strange examples of the sort of information we need to get together. And that's mainly to present to the council to make sure that that exemption is achieved. So that's an effort in itself. A smooth and timely exit, that's pretty important as every developer wants their site back on time. And then finally, triggering other potential tax breaks is something that we'll cover off in a couple of slides. But there's other financial benefits from helping the charity sector in this way, which are quite unknown when it comes to planning consultants, architects, and a lot of finance guys within development teams don't know about tax breaks. It's just not a natural conversation that normally happens. Brilliant. Mark, could I have the next slide, please? Excellent stuff. Alfie, this one's going to be more about you. So submitting collated evidence, Alfie and his buddies got me to sign a witness statement, proper go to a lawyer, stand in front of them, swear that this is all true, all that kind of thing, because that's what Bromley Council wanted, along with pictures and photographs, videos of charitable use of the space, keeping a record, even looking at the electricity consumed, so looking at the bills and the actual consumption, not just saying, oh, here's an electricity bill. All of those things in the charities' names were prepared as part of this pack.
Mhm.
Alfie, is there
Yeah, I mean,
something?
I would
Yeah.
note that that level of detail is not typical in this case, because the building is effectively it's a former annex to the council offices. It's literally on their doorstep, so they were walking past it on a daily basis. The planning team used to work from this office, so they were sort of well aware of the condition of the building and everything. So that's a bit of an unhelpful starting point. Plus, the fact is there was a lot of money involved. I think it was £750,000 worth of CIL that would have been liable for the whole building, and it would go down to nothing if we were successful in proving that it was in use for that period of time. So they weren't rolling over particularly easily on this, and typically you just serve the notice to the council, tick a box and sign it saying yes, the building has been in use. Maybe sometimes just send some photos that demonstrates that it's been in use, but and that's the end of the story. In this case, the council queried us, and we had a few rounds of going backwards and forwards with evidence to demonstrate eventually to their satisfaction, albeit slightly reluctant satisfaction, that part of the buildings have been in use for well, in excess of 6 months continuously. So as you said, Cherish, there's a package of information that we sort of as a team pulled together. That included like the lease for A-Stop, invoices in relation to fitting out the building because it was in quite a poor condition. So demonstrating that sort of electrics and water and internet provision had all been provided. Numerous dated photographs and videos, utility bills you mentioned, plus your statutory declaration. And I think we also included WhatsApp correspondence between A-Stop and the tenants confirming sort of operational requirements for the building, making sure that people, just adding a sort of dimension to it that this has clearly been functional for a period of time. And it was a quite a large body of evidence that we submitted. And we were fortunate that in the end of this process, the council sort of, as I say, rather reluctantly accepted that they agreed it had been in use for that period of time. And essentially that avoided us having to then go down the appeal route and appealing the process. So that provided the comfort to the client at that juncture that they wouldn't have this large expense to bear.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
So just on the experience of working with councils, one thing I've learned from some of my other clients, so councils are clients of ours as well when it comes to charity-led rates mitigation. And they sometimes are a bit harder on themselves because they're like, we never want to be accused of being on the wrong end of an investigation or an audit. So sometimes I think because the prior owner was Bromley Council and everyone knew that Bromley Council was offloading this asset and they're hoping it would convert into flats, they didn't want to be seen to be just giving out CIL too easily. That's me guessing, speculation, but based on what I've seen of other councils, they can sometimes be harder on assets they were involved with themselves in some way or another, or if they're freeholders when it comes to shopping centres. Alfie, have we covered off everything we need to share about the timing of the application for the CIL exemption, actually the submission of the form? I guess that's all okay. We've covered that.
Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, cool. And responding to council questions, again, I remember seeing some of those really long emails asking for more details, but I think we've kind of
Mhm.
discussed that in depth as well. And as Alfie said, the ultimate outcome was £750,000 was achieved in CIL savings, which was on 72 flats, the equivalent of £10,000. And this is what the landlord told us, and I'm pretty sure told Alfie as well. That made the difference between this site being viable and not viable. So not just is the developer the beneficiary of that, it would have been near on impossible for Bromley Council to be able to sell this asset, stroke liability, depending on how you want to see it, and see the chance for these flats to be built, which will reduce pressure on the housing crisis that we're currently seeing at the moment as well. So kind of everyone wins if you look at it from the right perspective. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. Okay, so we're now going to just talk about the other financial and social benefits as well. So we've clustered it into a group of three, group of two, group of one. So firstly, security costs, which when we first got there, there was a man and a dog and a van, and that was costing the landlord £1,000 a week to keep this site secure because it was the home of a lot of kind of antisocial activity amongst youngsters. And it was hard to protect this site. There was a right-of-way pathway going between the council and the local park and the side street. And you couldn't lock the gate there. It was all sorts of complications. So us being there and bringing in our own team and our own activities reduced the costs for security. It meant slightly more positive engagement with the community as well. And obviously we kind of had to deal with the police as well because there were some problem parts to this estate as well. Nothing to do with us, but we kind of were on the wrong end of it at some point. Plus, the insurance company, insurance brokers do not like empty buildings. They normally either double the premium or they'll reduce your cover to flee, which is an insurance term, which is for another conversation. But always look out for that. Your insurer might sting you when it comes to a void. So all of these problems are circumvented by working with someone like us to actually actively use a space. Next, Doc. Thank you, Mark. So you're meeting your ESG, environmental, social governance goals, corporate social responsibility, however you want to define that. It's not just a box ticking exercise anymore. People actually want to see and understand everyone from potential employees to your stakeholders. They want to know that you're doing the right thing. And significant benefits to charity occupiers as well. So just to give you an example, these are some of the charities that we helped in this Bromley building. Thread Ahead basically takes leftover nice stuff from the fashion industry, where previously they would have just chucked this stuff away. And instead of doing that, they provide that through a very dignified channel. Those items will get passed on, cleaned up, stored, sorted, repaired if necessary. And then they will go to households who are either on low income, asylum seekers, those with questionable immigration status who don't have any other benefits. So it's reducing waste, it's helping the fashion industry do the right thing, and it's helping someone who might have nothing in their possession at the moment. So, and in a very dignified way that boosts their confidence. So that was Threadhead. So those are the sorts of wonderful organizations who can do magic without any money, but sometimes they just need the space. And finally, we've got one more little bullet point here. So just briefly, there's two other tax breaks that we want to tell you about. So when you work with the charity sector, charities get a massive reduction on the business rates. It's 80%. So we're basically sharing about two-thirds to three-quarters of that with the landlord. There are some examples. So on this building alone, the rate saving during that year and a half was probably around £70,000, which is big in its own right, but it's dwarfed by the size of the CIL savings as well. But it's an extra bonus because if you are going to use it, you may as well use it in the best way possible. And if you can't find a commercial tenant, this is one of the best things that you can do. The other tax break is if you basically donate a piece of clothing in an Oxfam shop and they sell it, they will send you an email saying, "Dear Alfie, we sold that shirt for £20. You said you're a UK taxpayer. Here's a little certificate to say thank you." And you can put that on your tax return and treat that as a £20 cash donation. So although Alfie's handed no money over, his shirt is the equivalent of £20, and that way he can say my taxable income has gone down by £20 and he gets more money back in his pocket. That concept translates into property. But again, a lot of the property world do not know this. It's not a natural conversation between accountants on one by background and their developers. So if you donate space to a charity for more than a year, you can treat the rent that you've foregone, which is roughly equal to the rateable value, as a donation in kind. So in this case, the Bromley site has the value, I think it had a rateable value of around £180,000 per annum. So that was deemed to be a charitable donation if you are a UK taxpayer. So there's these things that can be uncovered if you're talking to the right people and trying to plan ahead, as Alfie would say. So that's kind of the Bromley example. If we can go to the next slide. Alfie and I have got some more examples that we want to briefly cover, and then it will be Q&A. So just to bring in some other potential stories, listed buildings don't normally pay empty rates. So you might ask yourself the question of, well, why would I bring in a charity or even a commercial organization to a slightly end-of-life building into a listed building? Again, the CIL thing makes it work. So even though your rates liability is zero, it's worth creating one because the size of the CIL savings are so large in return. Plus, you start to get the community engagement that little bit earlier. When size matters, Alfie, I'm going to have to hand over to you on this one because I still don't quite understand this. But we're in a five-story building in Monument. It was taken off the VOA listing for rates purposes years ago because it was literally concrete shell. But the landlord bought the ground floor back into use and has brought us into the building because I believe that is going to be, although costing money in rates and activation of the space, it can get him out of CIL. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's correct. The legislation only refers to part of the building being in use. It doesn't need the whole of the building. So it's a little bit spurious about what actually is a part of a building, but it's generally considered that a small portion of a building being in a use is sufficient to say that the whole building has been in use and justify the exemption on that basis.
Okay, but all the
So
other usual rules apply. Continuous 6 months.
yes,
And
yeah, yeah,
also, if it was an office, use it as an office, that kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay, which means you and I can't open a nightclub together, not with a charity sector under the way.
No, not unless it's a charitable nightclub of some sort, but
Yeah,
you never know.
absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so I think so. Legislation says that this CIL concept applies across the country, but local authorities decide is the CIL rate zero or like hundreds of pounds. So is
Yes,
that right?
yeah. Yeah, that's correct. They'll set a still rate is based on a valuation exercise and it has to be approved at government level. But yeah, they propose a still rate and it needs to be, well, for various different uses. Some uses may not be subject to still rate. Some areas like regeneration areas may be exempt from CIL, for instance, or have a lower CIL rate. So yeah, it all varies. Address by address almost,
Okay.
and use by use.
Absolutely. So, for example, we've worked with a developer who's converting an unused accountant's office in a business park into, I think, student accommodation because it's right next to the university, and his exposure on a CIL bill in Chelmsford was £164,000, which again for Chelmsford and for that sort of switchover was quite a big number. So I
Mhm.
guess look out for this. It may not just be the likes of London and the home counties, it may be further afield as well. Alfie, have you got any other stories that you can share with us?
Yeah, there was just one other point I wanted to touch on because I've been looking at it this week, just to give an example of the potential costs involved. Um, I've been working for a number of years on a scheme that involves the amalgamation of two residential units into one in Barnet. It's a big, well, it will be a big new dwelling of 400-ish square meters, but the site had been left vacant for a long period of time, almost strategically, so it benefited from VAT savings. But we got the CIL liability notice through, I think it was last week, and the liability is upwards of £500,000. So it's got a very high rate of CIL for new residential development in that area. Luckily, we had already sort of accepted that that was going to be the case, but we've got a separate strategy to seek a exemption as a self-build dwelling. But this is just to highlight that there are potentially very high costs involved, and the sooner people are aware of it at an early stage, the better. You're on mute, Sheriff.
Thanks. Sorry, I was drinking water, so I thought I'd mute myself,
Ah.
but I've paid the price of having to wait for Mark to unmute me. So apologies for that. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that, Alfie. Next slide, please. Excellent. Great. Alfie, thank you so much. I think we have time. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. You might have a few
Yes.
questions already lined up, so fire away.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, again, feel free to pop questions in the chat if you've got any specific scenarios or thoughts triggered by this as well. And also, yeah, feel free to if you've got a deeper conversation that needs to be had regarding a project or something, do feel free to book using the contact details or the booking link as well. But we've got a few questions that have come in so far. So I think. Let's kick off with this one, which is flexible charities are great. What level of savings are achieved, and what guarantees do you and they offer to leave on time? And is there any PR fallout from that?
Okay, so the savings are at least 50% of the MT rates that you would have incurred. Depending on your tax circumstances, it could be 100%. Again, because of that kind of Oxfam donation thing that I mentioned earlier on. All the charities know upfront that this is a flexible rolling notice, 1 month's notice sort of arrangement. We normally give them a rough timeline because Alfie will say it's going to take us about 6, 12 months, etc. They sign stat decks, so it's outside the act. And if there is ever a problem, we won't work with them again. So that alone kind of keeps them all on track. So we've never had a problem with them asking someone to leave at the end. So that hopefully gives the landlord the comfort that they need.
Okay. Well, we have I think two questions that might be related. First one, can you define lawful use, please? And the next one is, does a temporary charity tenant, even if rent-free, risk negatively impacting change of use from office to say residential, or does the economic viability argument overarch that?
Okay, I'll take the
Yeah,
second one. Alfie, do you
okay.
want to take the first one?
Yeah, well, the issue of lawful use in planning, you could spend hours and hours talking about that, I'm afraid. But in simple terms, effectively, buildings and land is sort of divided up into planning units. So, like a house is a planning unit, an office is a planning unit, for instance. And pretty much every planning unit has a lawful use, and that's the use in which the building can be used. Without being subject to enforcement against a council, and that can be well, in more recent simplistic terms, the lawful use is generally established through a planning permission. So if you get planning permission for a new house and build it, its lawful use is as a house. But you can, there's buildings that have existed prior to planning and have never had planning permission for anything, and they have permissive lawful use rights for whatever the long-standing use is. You also can have established a lawful use from continuously operating that use for a period of 10 years or more. So if you had a house, for instance, that was operated as an office for more than 10 years, its lawful use then becomes an office, not a house. So yeah, I mean that's just an overview, but it's a whole rabbit warren of a conversation, because there's no end of legal debates that take place about what is or isn't an existing use of a building,
Okay.
all around planning and whether you can or can't get planning permission for alternatives.
Okay. So the short answer to your question is speak to me privately.
Yeah, well, yes, yeah. If there's a building where the lawful use is in doubt, yes, definitely.
Okay, cool. So just to answer the question about, sorry, I didn't cover off the PR bit when it comes to charities leaving a space. But also in relation to that, does it affect your planning application if you've kind of given the space out to a charity? Because somebody at the council might say, well, there's still life in that X shop. So basically, it's again PR exercise. So when we're focusing on we've left a building, we focus on the fact that okay, we were able to do X, Y, and Z during these last few years. Thank you very much to the landlord for giving us that opportunity because they didn't have to. So that kind of deals with the PR side on that perspective. And when it comes to planning, we work with the likes of Alfie, and we make sure that we submit a copy of the lease that says it's rent free. And obviously, Alfie will have a pack of information showing that we've done this much marketing and no one's taken an interest in renting this shop or office at a market value. It's not viable, etc., etc. So when you put those
Yeah.
two together, I'm not aware of any case where a council has kind of kicked up a fuss and said, "Oh, you've given it rent free to a charity, so there's life in the building. You can't convert it over."
Yeah, well, I would say though, you do need to be very careful, particularly in London. We're dealing with this a lot, where like let's say offices to hotel use, for instance. I've got probably 4 or 5 of those schemes that we've been dealing with recently, where it's sort of long-term vacant office use, and the planning policy requires you to demonstrate that it's been vacant for a long period of time and has marketing evidence advertising it for, often it's either 12 or 24 months of active marketing efforts to try and let the space for offices before they all sort of relinquish that existing use. So you have to play a very careful dance around that, and navigate like getting away from the existing use and moving into a new use, and the timings and the type of tenure that an office user might have in that period needs to be carefully managed. But for example, in one case I'm actively looking at in Camden, the marketing exercise is ongoing, but we're saying that well, we're not just saying this is the case. The client or the owner of the building is using the building as their own sort of temporary office while the marketing process is ongoing. But so we're using that as saying, well, there is no market demand for this use. It's just being used as a temporary office, but that, for the purpose of CIL, satisfies the requirements. But we also, at the same time, are demonstrating that there's a lack of market interest in it. So there are very fine margins around these things, and you do need to be sort of careful with how it's presented, because there's two sides to many of these coins, and you need to sort of make sure it lands right with the council.
Excellent stuff. Mark, are you picking out any more questions that we can cover?
Yeah, we've got one from Vanessa, who's a little bit confused still regarding whether the occupancy of a small part of a building negates the CIL liability for the whole building. I.e., you mentioned part of the office cannot be used for storage, etc.
Yeah, so just to reconfirm on that, a small part of a larger building can justify its use as offices, but it actually needs to be used as an office. So you can't just use it for storage. It needs to be used for, whatever an office is used for, people sat around desks and working, essentially. One of the very first appeal cases on CIL was around a pub that had been used for like storage of tables and chairs and other pub paraphernalia, but it wasn't actually trading and being used as a pub. So that didn't meet the tests. So it actually needs to, be used in operation as an office rather than just, storage or any other ancillary type use.
Excellent stuff.
But to reconfirm, only a small portion. If it is like, a handful of tables and chairs, that would be enough.
Okay, cool.
Even if it's in a huge office building, that's sufficient.
Just to elaborate on that, Vanessa, so we had something similar. If you imagine the 20,000 square foot office space in Bromley that we had, it was primarily an office. But every charity will have a little kind of stationary cupboard as well. So no one's going to come in from the council and say, "Oh, mate, you got a storage cabinet with paper, A4 paper in it and printers." You fail because you've used it for storage. It's ancillary to the use of the office, but it doesn't become just the storage cabinet for office equipment. So hopefully that kind of helps answer the question. But again, as always, speak to Alfie if you've got anything concerning going through your mind as well. Mark, any others? I'm conscious that some people will disappear while the Q&A carries on. You've got all our contact details on the screen at the moment, so feel free to note that down. And you've got the web page, which hosts more. But Alfie, if you're okay for time, we can try and cover off on some of these other ones as well.
Yeah, I'm okay for a few more minutes.
Okay.
Sure.
Mark.
Okay, we got 2 or 3 more questions. So I think Elena wants just a bit of confirmation that is she right in understanding that the proposed mitigation scheme is relevant when the existing buildings are converted, redeveloped, or extended only. The scheme isn't applicable when land to be developed is used for farming or grazing purposes.
So yeah, well, CIL is dealing with floor space only. So if there's no floor space and it's just open land, or it's quite interesting around CIL. You do have debates about what is or isn't floor space, and usually you refer to the RICS Red Book definition of floor space. Which is typically covered areas enclosed on at least 3 sides. So balcony areas and things like that don't meet the definition. You don't have to pay CIL on those, but in some instances, winter gardens do. And in some cases, carports do, but sort of covered garages don't necessarily have to. So yeah, it's all in relation to floor space, not the change of use of land itself. So open land without building or built form is fine.
Okay, and then we have a question regarding vacant building credit from Matthew. If a building has been vacated for sole purposes of redevelopment, can you claim VBC or vacant building credit?
I believe you can. I've only dealt with vacant building credit on very rare instances, and I don't think I've ever had it accepted. But I think that's a product of working in London, where it's typically not accepted. Outside of London, I imagine as I understand it, yeah, I think you can, but I think it needs to be relatively long-term vacancy for that to apply. I'm happy to have a separate discussion on that, but I'm afraid I'd have to do a bit of research before answering fully.
Okay, great stuff. I can see one from an old client of mine, Jacob. I'm actually seeing Jacob next week, so I'll explain that one in a bit more depth when I see him. But I think his accountant has asked a question about on the business rate savings and the donating of space. There's a little bit of confusion there. So those are very separate items. Business rate savings will happen from day one right throughout, however long it takes, whether it's 6 months, 16 months, whether it goes past the 1 year mark or not. That's always there. When it comes to donating space to a charity, you have to box clever when it comes to things like this. So, for example, when you go into a high street and you buy a Christmas card off what you think is the Cancer Research, the charity shop, you're actually buying it from their trading subsidiary. So this is the way the charity sector is structured in the UK. So yes, you can still treat the space as being donated for charitable purposes, even though you are benefiting from that, but you have to structure it properly. And that's where we kind of guide you through that process. So Jacob, I'll chat with you next week on that. And if anyone else wants to know and understand more, they're welcome to reach out.
Great. I think that covers everything. So yeah, just to summarize again, and what I put in the chat as well, a summary of this topic and a recording of the webinar will be made available on stop.org.uk/more about CIL shortly after we finish off with the webinar.
Excellent stuff. Our contact details are here. I think there's a final page which just says thank you. So again, the contact details are there. I hope you found this useful. Feel free to reach out to us directly or to Mark just to give us your feedback. We're happy to run more on a group basis. Like if you want us to come into your office where you're a firm of architects or something, happy to do that. Happy to bring Alfie, the Yoda man, with us as well if he's interested and available, and take you on this journey with us in future. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Mark.